A collaborative of 4 different newsrooms, the Great Lakes News Collaborative has shaped a public dialogue in Michigan that can serve as a model to other regions.
In May of 2022, the Great Lakes News Collaborative dug into the issues of our aging water infrastructure with our project, Water's True Cost. We are proud to announce that the project has received a 2022 U.S. Water Prize for Outstanding One Water Communications. The 4 partners in the Great Lakes News Collaborative would like to thank the U.S. Water Alliance for the award, and you, our viewers, listeners, and readers, for your support, which makes our work possible.
Hello, everyone, and we're excited to bring you another in this series of online events with Bridge Michigan and Circle of Blue about what's most important to our health, our economies, and our environment in the Great Lakes. And that, of course, is water. I'm J. Carl Ganter, Managing Director of Circle of Blue, where we're covering these stories around the world from our base on the shores of Lake Michigan. And we're bringing you the most in-depth journalism through the Great Lakes News Collaborative, which, in addition to Bridge and Circle of Blue, includes Michigan Radio and Detroit Public Television's Great Lakes Now. And this series couldn't come at a more important moment. In previous programs, we've asked, will the Great Lakes become a climate refuge? And what's water's true cost? And today we're taking this a step further. We're going green where green shouldn't be. Expansive blooms of toxic algae are poisoning drinking water and closing beaches. They're creating oxygen-deprived aquatic dead zones in the Great Lakes, across the nation, and around the globe. Excess amounts of nutrients are washing into waterways from expanding agriculture in cities, and the blooms they feed represent a growing water quality crisis that will further deteriorate under climate change. And here's an excerpt from the documentary broadcast on public television stations across Michigan earlier this week.
Lake Erie is the canary in the coal mine for the Great Lakes.
The whole lake is green. I mean, as far as the eye can see, the water's green.
It's scary what I see. You sit on your boat for 20 minutes and your eyes will start to burn.
What needs to happen is for there to be real accountability.
And Circle of Blue is publishing a 6-part special report, Danger Looms for Toxic Algae Blooms, that goes deep into the sources and the solutions. And today we'll be joined by experts, moderated by Keith Schneider, Circle of Blue's chief correspondent and author of the report. For more than a decade, he's covered the most important water stories across 6 continents, from the front lines of India's water and food crises to China's water energy challenge. Keith notes that reporting the complexities behind harmful algae blooms has been one of his toughest assignments. And today you'll hear more about Keith's findings. And I'll note that this event is supported by the Herb Family Foundation and Bosch and co-hosted by Bridge Michigan. And the Circle of Blue series is produced with support from the Joyce Foundation and Herb Family Foundation. And the Great Lakes News Collaborative is supported by the Charles Stewart Mott Foundation and by your contributions. It seems everyone knows harmful algae blooms are a problem, and in most cases, agriculture is upstream. Senator Debbie Stabenow is chair of the U.S. Senate Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry, sets the scene for us today.
Hello, and thanks to Circle of Blue and Bridge Michigan for inviting me to join you today. All of you are doing such important work on water quality issues here in Michigan. Thank you so much. That's something I've also been laser focused on during my time in the Senate, as you know. The good news is that today there are more resources to help make sure everyone has clean and safe water than at any time in our recent memory. The Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act makes the biggest investment in the Great Lakes in our nation's history, adding $1 billion in funding for the Great Lakes Restoration Initiative, which I authored in 2010. That will complete cleanup work on 24 remaining areas of concern. It also makes the single largest ever investment in our drinking water, wastewater, and stormwater infrastructure, which will help reduce discharges into our lakes. In addition, the new Inflation Reduction Act commits $20 billion to help farmers in Michigan and across the country protect water quality by improving soil health and better managing nutrients. That's the biggest single investment in agriculture conservation since the Dust Bowl. We know these programs can work to prevent harmful algae blooms. Since 2010, the GLRI has kept more than 2 million pounds of phosphorus out of our waterways, but we know that much more can and needs to be done. About 3 times as many farmers want to adopt proven conservation practices like cover crops, nutrient management, buffer strips, as we have had funding available to do these things. The Inflation Reduction Act is going to help close that gap and keep more soil and nutrients on Michigan fields and out of the Great Lakes. We couldn't have made these strides without the work of organizations including Circle of Blue and Bridge Michigan, and all of the ways in which all of you are involved. Thanks again for the really important work that you're doing to protect Michigan's water, and I'm always proud to be your partner.
Senator Stabenow notes that Michigan and the Great Lakes have real incentives to solve the problem. So let me hand it over to Keith Schneider, who will introduce our guests, moderate a dynamic conversation, and include your questions submitted when you registered or through the chat. Keith, it's all yours.
Thanks so much, Carl. Hi, everybody. How are you? You know, the Senator just noted the extraordinary investment that Congress just made in federal farm conservation programs, $18.05 billion, one-time shot into farm conservation. That's equal to the amount of money that spent on farm conservation over the last 5 years as a result of the 2018 Farm Bill. So for the first time in a long, long time, we actually have the money to get at some of the solutions that our guests will talk about. First up is Alexis Smith. She's an activist and she's with the Freshwater Future. She's the Community Technology Coordinator. Then we have Sandy Bin. She's a longtime activist in Ohio. She's the Lake Erie Waterkeeper. And Rob Michaels, who's with the Environmental Law and Policy Center in Chicago and has done yeoman's work on Lake Erie and with the concentrated animal feeding operation permit that's in discussion here in Michigan. So Alexis, take it away.
Thanks, Keith, and thank you all for the invite and welcoming me to the panel and having this platform. I'll just start off by saying that, you know, how I got involved. And basically, I've been involved with activism and community work since I was in junior high. It's what my mom did for a living after being a kindergarten teacher and moving to Toledo. You know, she got involved right away in community activism and organizing, and it came with the territory. So, you know, she instilled in us in a young age the importance of public service and giving back to the community. When we talked about the harmful algal blooms, you know, we have been working on social economic issues in the Junction community where I am. I'm based, and I'll go back and I'll say I'm based in Toledo, Ohio, right in the Junction community, which is right in the central city. Toledo used to be the old Onyx neighborhood. And I lived in Detroit until I was 12 years old. I was born in Toledo, moved to Detroit, and moved back to Toledo. And I've been here ever since. I went to high school and college here. And it was actually my freshman year going into college that the Toledo water crisis had hit. And when all of the work that we were doing around social issues shifted to environmental justice issues. And because that day we realized we were, as a community that is a low income, disinvested community, was extremely vulnerable to what had happened that day. Us being without water for 3 days, not being able to not only consume the water, but even touch the water. It was a severe culture shock, and it was something that we realized we just were not prepared for. years later, the impact and the toll that that has had on the community is that there is a severe distrust in the quality of our water. There's a lot of people I know, including myself and my families, that, you know, just don't trust consuming tap water. We'll use it to clean and you know, do other daily, you know, activities with. But in terms of consuming tap water, I mean, you can literally taste the difference in just the quality of the tap water. So, you know, there's an extreme lack of distrust even today because of what happened with the toxic algal bloom outbreak. And more importantly, I mean, it has also had a significant impact on the affordability of water today. Our water rates have risen over the last 5 years and will continue to rise, especially as our water system is looking to have more future improvements. Right now, there's about $300 million that were invested into improving our water system. Some of that being just historical infrastructure updates that needed to happen. But additionally, I mean, it was due in part to the harmful algal blooms and needing to include treatment systems that would make sure that the issue that we experienced in 2014 wouldn't happen again. And these are short-term treatment solutions that they're including in the water system upgrade plans. So we know that there are more, there are more improvements, more costs to come.
You know, I interviewed Andy McClure, who runs the water treatment plants there. He told me that the big cost in Toledo in dealing with the 2014 bloom was the $50 million put into an ozone purification plant for the plant. Thank you so much, Alexis. Sandy has been at this for a long time, and we could talk about every aspect of this issue, including its frustration over that long a period of time. But, you know, Sandy, where are we going with harmful algal blooms, do you think? If you could sum up where we've been and then where we're going. Oh, she's muted.
Okay.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
We built our home in '87 on the shores of the eastern edge of Maumee Bay and western edge of Lake Erie. So I look at it every day and I'm inspired by these incredible waters. You know, in 2005, we formed the Lake Erie Waterkeeper program licensed by the Waterkeeper Alliance. But the story of the algae is this. In the 80s, we didn't have the algae we had, and that started in the 90s and have continued ever since. In the mid 90s, farmers from Wood County and other places in Ohio started to objecting to these things called confined animal feeding operations. They were brought here, the dairy ones were brought here from the Netherlands, who had banned them because of water quality problems. And Ohio State University actually was the one that brought the dairy CAFOs to Northwest Ohio. Ohio permitted those facilities and they're still here today, although Vrieberhoff itself went bankrupt. In 2010, the universities and the governments decided that 90% of the cause of this algae is from agriculture. And they said that most of that problem was from commercial fertilizer. And in 2014, we know that the commercial, the Toledo water crisis happened. Also, there was an interview with Lester Graham here on public radio or public radio. And what happened was the Ohio Farm Bureau stated there was a 40% reduction in commercial fertilizer phosphorus being used in the fields. That should have resulted in less algae. But in fact, the algae kept growing and growing. So in 2017, a big hog processing plant was located in Coldwater, Michigan, which is kind of where Ohio, Michigan, and Indiana meet. They said there'd be 100 new hog processing plants. They're owned by Smithfield, who was bought out by China, the Chinese government and a Chinese corporation. And they, China wanted to locate in the US because it's about 50% cheaper to raise hogs in the US than it is in China. And that's because grain is cheaper here in the US and also environmental regulations are less. In China, you have to treat for E. coli and you have to limit the number of animals in a watershed. We have neither in the US. And you need to know that the Maumee watershed here is, the old black swamp. We've got the most ditch miles, over 14,000 miles of ditch miles, and more tile drains than anywhere in the United States. In 2017, there was a fish kill caused by manure and runoff, and the operators of the CAFOs had to pay for the fish, but there were no citations for water quality. Nothing happened. In 2019, absent any growing information or any information on how the numbers of CAFOs and manure, et cetera, was changing, the Environmental Working Group and ELPC did a study from 2005 to 18 that showed a 40% increase in the amount of manure and phosphorus coming into the watershed. In 2019, there was a really neat example that should have, I think, captured the whole thing. We had heavy rains and the farms weren't supposed to plant or didn't plant because of the heavy rains. So we got a lot less of the phosphorus applied to the fields. So we would have thought, I thought, we'd have less algae. We had more. It was the worst year ever. And so, when we asked about the CAFO situation, which have, hold the manure about a year at a time, we were told by the government that they didn't apply it. Well, where did it go? So by 2021, the Ohio Department of Agriculture, said we've had an 88% increase in the number of animal units and the amount of manure and phosphorus going on the ground, comparable. But that's been offset by decreases in commercial fertilizer use. So this weighing between commercial fertilizer and manure continues. In 22, we got a grant from a California foundation, and professors from Wisconsin and Marquette show that when you increase CAFOs, and they did the study between 2010 and 18, you increase the amount, the manure increases the amount of dissolved phosphorus coming into Lake Erie. This year, there's an $18 million study for 6,000 acres in the Ohio watershed that is supposed to pay premium dollars for BMPs to bump up the to see how that'll reduce the phosphorus. There's not one CAFO on any of those 6,000 acres. And, history just tells us that source reduction is it. And just last week, Jeff Reuter from the Ohio Sea Grant Program said in the 70s, it took 9 years for the algae to be reduced and the phosphorus by 60% from wastewater plants and taking phosphorus out of laundry detergent. He says 13 years later, we're seeing no progress. There's no reduction in the phosphorus. And the problem is that we, in terms of what we are seeing is, and the other strange part of this is the amount of phosphorus being used by farmers, family farmers, is going down. They used to apply phosphorus at 40 parts per million. It's now down to 20, and some of them are using no phosphorus at all, which is great. But at the same time, we've had these incredible increases in phosphorus from manure. Even this year, Ohio is permitting more hog farms, more dairy farms, and more poultry farms. So the answer, is simply source reduction. That's what reduced the algae in Lake Erie before. That's what has brought the crab and the oyster back to the Chesapeake. And we need that same source reduction here. We need to say that manure is a waste. We need to tell the meat and dairy industry they have the same rules as human sewage. And Big Ag needs to pay for the proper treatment and disposal of manure. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. Appreciate it. And our last guest is Rob Michaels. When I started this project months ago, I had this long conversation with Rob, who filled me and started me on the right track of the kinds of things I'd need to know and the kinds of places I'd need to look. And so Rob, I've asked Rob to talk about his work to declare Lake Erie impaired and how that relates to the CAFO permitting process in the state of Michigan, in which the state has essentially given up on trying to restrict the CAFO manure applications here in the state. Rob?
Hi, thanks, Keith, and thanks to Sandy and Alexis and to everyone else for being here today. So I can tell you briefly, and it's hard to do without getting too deep into the legal weeds, but in essence, under the Clean Water Act, if a water body is not meeting water quality standards, it's not drinkable, fishable, swimmable, and despite all the what are typically known as point sources of pollution, permitted discharges, wastewater treatment plants, industrial facilities, then that water body is impaired in the tool to deal with that impairment under the Clean Water Act is known as a total maximum daily load, or a TMDL. And so it was before I even got to ELPC, I think it was in 2018, it was clear that Lake Erie was impaired by toxic algae outbreaks, but Ohio wasn't deeming the lake to be impaired. And because they wanted to avoid the obligation to do a TMDL. And so, sparing you all the gory details, we filed a total of 3 lawsuits to get the lake deemed impaired and to require preparation of a TMDL. And the most recent lawsuit, after we defeated the federal government's motion to dismiss, gets complicated because we actually sued the federal government, even though the primary obligation of doing the TMDL is on the state of Ohio. But the upshot of it is that as a result of the current lawsuit and the prior lawsuits, which got it deemed impaired to begin with, Ohio has agreed to prepare a TMDL. And what that's supposed to do is cap the amount of phosphorus pollution going into Lake Erie. And there's a deadline now for that TMDL to be done. Presently, they have to release a final or a draft complete TMDL by the end of this calendar year, and then deliver a final TMDL to the federal EPA for it to approve or disapprove by the middle of next year. I think those deadlines are fixing to be extended a little bit because, unfortunately, the draft TMDL materials that Ohio has released so far have been grossly inadequate, and we detailed this in comments. I mean, so a lot of my time has been spent, on the litigation to get the TMDL done, and then now in Ohio, at least, engaging on the TMDL process, among other things. This is a really important issue to understand about the history of this problem. Phosphorus can, in essence, come into the lake in 2 forms. It can be attached to soil particles, particulate phosphorus, or it can be soluble or dissolved. And what the algae, the cyanobacteria, really feast on, what really makes them grow, is the dissolved phosphorus. And so the story Sandy told about the shift in agriculture really ties into this, because what we've seen is, that measures to reduce erosion and loss of soil are effective can be effective at reducing the loads of particulate phosphorus in the lake. But when the CAFO model of agriculture started to really take off in the 90s, and then the animal numbers in CAFO started to skyrocket after that, the dairy and the hog operations in particular shifted to liquid manure management, liquid manure systems. In those liquid manure systems, the phosphorus is in dissolved or soluble form. So you have to, that's the pollutant that needs to be controlled. But unfortunately, the TMDL so far, at least in the draft documents Ohio's released, is focused on total phosphorus, which includes particulate phosphorus and DRP. And because DRP is driving the algae blooms, but it's a relatively small component of total phosphorus, you could reduce total phosphorus by 40% and not make any dent in DRP, which is why the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement targets 40% reduction in both pollutants, both DRP and total.
So, Rob, can I just quickly get you to tie this to the fact that in Michigan, we had a chance to get at curtailing dissolved phosphorus from our CAFOs, and we missed that chance. And how did we miss that chance?
So so that's what we've been up to in Ohio. In Michigan, we've been deeply engaged on this CAFO general permit. So in Michigan, and it's better than Ohio in many ways. Michigan requires CAFOs to apply for and get a Clean Water Act permit, sometimes known as a National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System, or NPDES permit. Michigan, they started requiring CAFOs to apply for these permits in the early 2000s. there was in every 5 years they update the permit. And in 2020, Michigan had they released a very strong draft CAFO general permit that, among other things, completely prohibited waste application in winter, which is a really dangerous practice because there's no crops to take up any nutrients, and all of that waste is going to run off when the snow melts or flow down through the tiles. And it also so in response to pressure from the ag sector, Michigan backed off. The Michigan Eagle backed off somewhat, not entirely, but significantly from the provisions of the proposed or draft 2020 permit. Even that wasn't nearly good enough for the Farm Bureau and for the CAFOs. They wanted to go back to the 2015 permit and have only the most minimal restrictions on waste application. And so, representing ourselves and a number of other environmental organizations, including a group, Alliance for the Great Lakes, environmentally concerned citizens of South Central Michigan, who've done really great work just on the ground, holding CAFOs accountable for individual violations. We intervened in this administrative proceeding that the Farm Bureau had initiated to challenge the permit and to help Eagle defend the permit and to advocate for additional provisions that we think need to be in that permit if it's going to have any chance of success. And those provisions include things like a complete ban on winter waste application, limiting liquid waste application over tile drain fields, which is a huge pathway for waste to get into the water. Another big focus, and this is a problem all over the Midwest, it's a big problem in Michigan, a big problem in Ohio, is that, this CAFO waste, it's a waste product. And so they just need to get rid of it. And so because crops only need so much phosphorus, the CAFOs themselves don't own or control enough fields to take the waste. And so they transfer it to others. And in a process in Michigan, it's referred to as manifesting. In Ohio, it's referred to as distribution and utilization, or D&U. And we've asked the administrative law judge in Michigan to have him much better. It gets, the details are complicated, but in effect, to have much tighter reporting and controls on the use of that transferred waste.
And let me just finish for you, Rob, very quickly. After all this, there's going to be one appeal after another appeal after another appeal. So this permit is probably not going to be issued or effective in any way before 5 years is up to write another permit in 2025.
That's right. And but in the meantime, there is someone asked there if there's winter cover crop, would the winter manure spreading be less harmful? That the winter cover crop isn't going to do that much, because the big problem is the snow melt. Right. That cover crop can only take up, when the ground's frozen, so much phosphorus. I mean, if you're putting liquid on an impervious surface, when the snow's melting in your neighborhood and you go to walk your dog, the park, people's yards, they're mush. That's what happens in the spring. And if there had been manure spread on people's lawns during the winter when the ground was frozen, even if the liquid waste froze, it's all going to be part of that soup. It's all going to run off.
Appreciate it. All right. We got a lot of questions that have come here. And the one that intrigues me, and maybe Sandy, you can answer this, is what will it take to have agriculture be more cognizant and take more account and more responsibility for this major pollution which has been occurring around the country and certainly in the Great Lakes? What brings them into accountability, do you think? What will it take?
A couple things. One is, we don't need to say agriculture anymore is the cause of the algae. We need to say it's commercial fertilizer and manure, and break them out. That's huge. And the reality is the family farms have been reducing the amount of phosphorus. I have more and more farmers in the Lake Erie watershed that tell me they're not using any phosphorus. What does that mean? That means manure has to be classified as a waste and managed accordingly. So pure and simple, reduce the sources and, have accountability. The money we're spending is money down a black hole. The BMPs are never going to solve the problem. I mean, they haven't done it for 13 years. There is no evidence that another 13 of the same old is going to work.
And, I found that in my reporting, for those that don't know what a BMP, it's a best management practices. It includes cover crops. It includes no-till, which is not cultivating your field. It includes planted buffer zones. It includes 2-stage ditches and 12 different other things called BMPs. What we have found in my reporting, what Sandy has let me know, it doesn't work. They don't work. They work to, they basically were designed to stop soil erosion. And as Rob pointed out, phosphorus applies, sticks to soil pretty close, but it does nothing to deal with dissolved reactive phosphorus. And if you read our series, you'll see, I've done a lot of reporting on that point. It's not working in the Great Lakes, and it certainly isn't going to work in the Great Lakes with all the tiling. And for those that don't know what the tiling is, we have subsurface drainage across 39% of Michigan's farmland and 49% of Ohio's and much of Wisconsin. Basically, the Great Lakes Basin is the most heavily tiled region in the country, maybe the world. And so any liquid that falls on the surface is going to get into those tiles and immediately move into the drainage ditches, into the streams and out to the lakes. So we have set up a way to farm in our region, which is advancing more phosphorus under the new kinds of farm practices that we're seeing, particularly concentrated animal feeding operations. Let me look at some other questions here. Is there something that we can do, we should be doing in marrying the urban concerns with the rural concerns in order to, begin to negotiate, in a more powerful way to stop this from happening? Alexis, can you answer that? Is there something we can do to marry these two interests in a way that gets action on this?
Well, I can say that Junction community has been one of those communities that's taken on that. We have, and I'll tell you what the outcome has been.
Mm-hmm.
But what we've done on our side is we have educated ourselves on what it means to have that urban runoff and how it contributes to that overall nutrient pollution. And we have had bioswales and rain gardens and all those sort of deterrents installed into our empty lots and rebeautifying, specifically in our community where there are so many blighted homes and empty lots, we've repurposed into these bioswales. What I can tell you, and what we've heard from experts, is that those practices are great and educating ourselves is always necessary. But in terms of what our overall impact is, it pales in comparison to the upstream polluters. So it's still good to do. And I think it's good practice, but there's more than anything, I think our voices downstream communities need to be at the table and explaining what the impact is, not just on the environment, but also on these families' lives when it comes to increasing the inaffordability of water. Our water rates have increased almost 67% over the last 5 years. I mean, there are real implications to what's happening upstream.
Thank you. I have a question here from one of the readers about neurotoxins. Rob, can you handle that? What are the health effects of harmful algal blooms?
Yeah, I'm really not the best person to talk about that, but I can say briefly, I mean, the algal blooms contain both neurotoxins and epotoxins, which are liver toxins. I can say a little bit about, the way that works is that we call it algae, but it's really, it's what it really is photosynthetic bacteria. There are numbers of different types of cyanobacterias. Microcystin is a leading one. That was the one that was really discussed in the context of the Toledo water crisis. And at least with that one, although they all can operate a little bit differently, when those bacteria die, they release these toxins which can cause, a range of neurological problems if they're consumed. And exactly what those conditions are and how that the medical science behind that, I'm really not the best person to speak on that. But I don't think it's I could certainly say this. I mean, there's no dispute about the danger. Pets have been killed by these toxins. It's obviously completely unsafe for humans to touch or consume it. So I'm not a doctor, and I'm not the best person to talk about what happens in the human body, but I know that as a general matter that the toxins are released by the cyanobacteria.
Good. We have a bunch of questions about CAFOs. Why do we not? Well, first of all, what I learned from Sandy and others I interviewed is that, confined animal feeding operations are a special class of polluter. They're in their own class. They produce as much waste as small cities, and they apply it to farmland or land untreated. I mean, the only NPDES permittee, I think that's right, Rob, that can handle untreated waste and apply it to land untreated. The question is, how is the regulatory system going to deal with it? And right now, Michigan is seen as one of the better regulators, and it can't deal with it. It's not dealing with it. Sandy, can you help me with this? I mean, how does America or the Great Lakes state begin to address pollution from this special class of polluters?
First, we have to have the data and the information that shows it, which the government and the universities are refusing to do. Second, we had 9 local communities in the Northwest Ohio pass resolutions asking for a Lake Erie executive order, which US EPA is considering, but I'm not too hopeful, asking that this be managed, that we identify sources. We've got to separate the commercial fertilizer source and the manure source, and we've got to talk about them separately. Mm-hmm. And thirdly, there is no one in this country that could get away with what big ag and meat and dairy is getting away with today. I mean, how can you have, and there's enough manure being applied in the Maumee watershed equals the state of Ohio's sewage in a whole population. It's crazy. So the answer has to be, first of all, we have to, if we would simply declare manure as a waste, if we don't allow any more, CAFOs to come into watersheds that are impaired, if we get local governments, able to sit at the table to say, hey, we're paying for this and you guys are passing that cost on to us, it's wrong. It just has to take a public upswelling, if you will, to the politicians. I appreciated Senator Stabenow's comments, but the reality is these BMPs are showing they're not working. And so it's money down that old black hole. Please address the problem and address the manure problem as it is and deal with it. Call it the waste and make it happen. There were 28 states that passed bans on phosphorus and laundry detergent years ago. And finally, Procter & Gamble stepped up and took it out. Taxpayers shouldn't be paying to treat the manure. Manure is a waste product of big livestock and big ag. And let's hold them accountable and make it happen.
Well, in the last report in our series, this will be 4 weeks from now, I think, or 3, I report on a very successful effort by local advocacy groups and national groups to bring cases against big dairy farmers in the Yakima Valley in Washington State under the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act. And they have basically, they beat 5 big CAFOs initially, signed a consent order that dramatically changed their operations, required water monitoring, no winter spreading, and other features of that consent order. And they applied now to 3 other CAFOs out there. Very successful use of the law. We have in Michigan a very successful use of the law involving a point source, but it can apply to any source under our powerful Michigan Environmental Protection Act, which allows citizens to bring suit against anybody polluting, impairing, and endangering natural resources, and occurred here in my home county in Benzie County involving a state fish hatchery. one of the most successful harmful algal bloom cleanups in America right now. Took 40 years of work to do it, which indicates the kind of time frame, and it was very expensive. These citizens around this lake reached into their own pocket to achieve that victory, and the result was, the big result of that was a restored lake. And secondly, they've established a very extensive water monitoring, water sampling network in the 162 square mile watershed. So you have, episodic instances in which citizens have fought successfully. What we haven't seen is any broad initiative at the legislative level, either in Congress or in the states, to do the same thing. I quoted Dan Mullinan, who runs the conservation district, the association in our state, saying, this is going to come because we're facing a crisis somewhere else other than Flint around this, and it could be Saginaw Bay, it could be in the lower Fox River watershed. I mean, it could be anywhere. So it just seems that the inertia is moving toward something, hopefully that's not such an emergency, but that may be occurring. Let me look.
Jump in and just say a real
go ahead
word on that. I mean, I think you did tie it back to like the phosphate and laundry detergent issue. I mean, what you really have here is just a massive case of these large livestock operations externalizing their costs onto the public, externalizing their waste disposal costs onto the public. And I know there were some comments in the chat about, are there technological, can you harvest the phosphorus out of the manure? I mean, mined phosphorus is actually getting more difficult to find, and it's expensive. Theoretically, who knows what could be done? The problem is none of that stuff is happening because there's no incentive to do it. I mean, until the Clean Air Act said, well, you limited mercury releases into the air, there wasn't a robust market for mercury scrubbing technology at coal plants. Well, then the law limited the releases, and lo and behold, all sorts of stuff can be developed and implemented. But until the regulatory system starts to force more of this cost to be internalized and doesn't allow it to be so completely externalized, then you're not going to see that, and you're going to be left with things like the use of RCRA in Washington State, which has been fantastic, but those are brutally hard cases against an individual facility where you have to prove. I mean, they had a great set of facts there where there were like upstream and downstream wells from one of the CAFOs that showed its contribution. And this is the last point I want to make in response to another comment in the chat, in something Sandy said. It was one of the things that we wanted, that we're asking to be improved in the Michigan CAFO permit, is better monitoring. Right now, the difference with like CAFO pollution or AFO pollution, slightly smaller facilities, but still concentrating animals using liquid waste systems, is when that runoff happens, it's not all like the wastewater treatment plant. It's just coming out of a pipe, and we can test the discharge out of that pipe, and you can measure the pollutants in it. With the runoff from livestock waste application, like a lot of it's, the surface flow is happening after following rainstorms, and that's when the tiles run too. Waste that was applied in the fall can actually end up running out of the tiles in the spring. So it's really important to require monitoring and measurement to bring this sector more in line with other sectors. And it's really complicated, but there are all sorts of deficiencies in the Clean Water Act for dealing with ag pollution, even CAFO pollution, that just don't exist with other sectors. So,
and I kept asking people that I talked to as I was reporting this, why don't we jump into the Clean Water Act and update it to reflect, contemporary conditions? And the response was, if we do that, we might lose important provisions of the Clean Water Act. I don't
Let's
know.
just call manure a waste. Let's just
What?
classify it as a solid waste and let's treat it accordingly and dispose of it accordingly. The laws are there, the rules are there. Call a spade a spade. Manure is a waste, sewage is a waste. Why is manure, sewage not a waste and human sewage a waste? Come on, folks. It's not that hard.
We have a couple questions here. Can one of you address climate change? Alexis, can you address climate change and how that's affecting this topic, this issue?
Sure. I mean, I know that I think it's NOAA that has a forecast that it posts every summer, seeing how rainfall and encourages the likelihood of a bloom taking place. What we see is, as some climate change can cause either those droughts where we don't have a lot of water or a lot of rain, or we have a lot of rain. And so it's definitely made, I think, a bit more unpredictable. And whereas we can try to forecast as much as we can, but it's really hard to get ahead of when it just might happen. And so I know, at least in Toledo, we're holding our breath, just to see if it happens every summer or not, depending on how hot or how dry it can be that summer.
People are really interested in CAFOs here. Really, really interesting. When we don't ordinarily think of how our food is produced, there's one piece that addresses one question that addresses the Farm Bureau. I don't know how to overcome the obvious obstacle of the Farm Bureau. Sandy, any thoughts on how to overcome the obstacle of the Farm Bureau? Got a 1.1 trillion. Go ahead.
For me, I get angry because this isn't hard. Everybody says it's complicated. It is not. Taking phosphorus out of laundry detergent was not complicated. They had to figure out how to do it. They had to figure out the technology. Wastewater plants had to figure out the technology to reduce phosphorus out of their discharge pipes.
Right.
Today, manure, we're changing how we do manure. We used to pasture it. Now we are confining it. There's too much manure, too close to the barns to manage. And furthermore, the need for phosphorus in our soils, at least in this area, continues to decrease.
Right.
With that fact, you would need even more land to apply it, but it is fundamentally, manure is a waste. And if it was, categorized as a solid waste and had to follow solid waste rules, you don't have to change the Clean Water Act. You don't have to do anything, and treat it and dispose of it accordingly, just as human waste. That's a simple answer to this. And why does it get a buy when there's, I don't know, I've heard 4 or 10 times as much manure produced in this country as there is human sewage. And most of the human sewage has to be treated. 4 times as much doesn't. And it's concentrated with pathogens, antibiotics, and all. We're talking about nutrients here in algae. There's a lot of other stuff in there that ain't good for the soils and isn't good for the environment.
Well, as part of this reporting that I did speak to the Natural Resources Director in Mercer County, Ohio, which is the county where Grand Lake St. Mary's is, which is one of the famous harmful algal bloom lakes in the country. And they have reduced their toxins in their lake by about 2/3 over the last decade. The harmful algal bloom is still there. They have tested many technologies to separate phosphorus out of swine manure. And what she said to me, what Teresa said to me, who directs this, she said to me, it's $100,000 for 10,000 gallons, to treating 10,000 gallons. And they just don't have, there's many technologies that can separate it, centrifuge it, move it into, become a solid, squeeze it into a solid, and maybe apply it on other farmland. But it's too expensive for individual farms to get to it. And the other piece of this is that this does nothing to help their production, right, of their product.
But
so,
Keith, it's not just individual. And she's terrific. She does great work. But these CAFOs are owned by integrators, are owned by the 5 big ag companies in the world and the country. So it's, we call about individual farms and the cost. The only thing that those integrators give to the farmer is the manure. The animals, the feed, the facilities, everything is managed so as to make sure the meat that we get is safe. But when it comes to the manure, they pass that problem on to the farmers. It is their problem. It is the integrators. It is Big Ag's problem. And those farms should not have to deal with this. It is Big Ag that has to find the way to treat the manure and deal with it. The small farmers shouldn't pay. Big Ag has to pay. They're the ones making all the money.
Well, let me ask you this question. Given that we made public the cost of upgrading and improving our municipal wastewater treatment systems in the 70s and early 80s, $100 billion spent. That's worth what, $600 billion now. Does the public have an opportunity, a responsibility, or no responsibility to help pay agriculture to deal with these wastes? That is, do we socialize this cost?
Why I don't understand this, because not only is it algae that happened in the 70s with the Clean Water Act, they required every industry in this country to have a discharge permit, MPDES permit,
Right.
and limit the amount of waste they were putting into our streams, be it metals, chemicals, whatever it was. And all those costs were internalized by the companies. Yeah, we're paying for them in the cost of our product. Why is Big Ag different? Why is livestock? These are major industrial facilities. This isn't, I don't get it. And why has the farmer been able to reduce the amount of phosphorus, saving him money and helping the lake? While sneakily, I think, because they don't show us the statistics, manure keeps growing in terms of the volumes coming in, and we don't see advances because whatever the farmer's reducing is more than made up by the amount of manure that's being added.
So it's a political issue. How do we change that political issue? I mean, how do you? I mean, we have this problem that's been around for now a generation or more. It's not getting any better. Our reporting, your expertise on all our panelists, probably many of those who are listening, know that what the solutions that are promoted by the land grant universities, the state agriculture departments, and the federal agriculture department aren't working in our region, right? So where's the point where there's enough of a
you know what? 28
challenge.
states had to pass bans on phosphorus and laundry detergent to make that happen. We need to get bans on manure, or call manure waste. Don't add them in impaired watersheds. There's things that can be done. We just need, the generic term of ag is causing, and farm runoff is causing the problem. Doesn't describe the two components: commercial fertilizer, which phosphorus use is going down, and manure applications, which are going up. Let's talk about it as it is and educate the public, so the public who loves our waters, who loves our Great Lakes, can do something and raise the public flag and get the politicians to take on Big Ag, which they don't want to do.
All right, we're coming up to closing on this. Do you want to make some closing comments? You want to start, Alexis? How are you? What have you drawn from this conversation?
Well, I mean, I've drawn that it's more than significant and important to not only talk about, but get real action behind. I think I've also drawn from the fact that, just from lived experience, that it's unfair for people to downstream to ratepayers and paying millions of dollars for it, and really an issue that's been around for generations, and it's just simply been neglected. So yeah, I think it's more than time. I think we all have tons of solutions, and it's a matter of implementing them.
Sandy?
Call manure waste a solid waste. And I mean, call us, that's it. I mean, thanks for the conversation, but everybody says it's complicated. It's not. And don't talk about CAFOs, as CAFO, talk about manure, what they produce. That is the problem for water. There's a lot of other issues with CAFOs, with food and the chain and everything else, but the issue with water is manure. And it's the manure application in the fields that are coming downstream and causing the green in the lake and the problems that we have, a big cause. Do the studies, show the impacts, and make the laws, and make manure a waste.
Rob?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to add to what Alexis and Sandy have said. I mean, I think that, things have to happen on two levels broadly, right? I mean, I think that there's no substitute for the, grinding legal work that we're doing in Michigan and Ohio and elsewhere around the region to try to improve permitting. I think there is a big opportunity with all this IRA money to try to get away from throwing money at the failed stuff we've been doing in the past of just more cover crops, more buffer strips. And instead, there was a question actually about what's being done in Europe. You know, one thing that they do in the Netherlands, for instance, is they require dairy waste to have higher solid component. We need to do that here. That's one of the things that we asked for on the Michigan CAFO permit. And the other thing is just more broadly, ties in more with what Sandy and Alexis were saying, is there has to be enough of a public outcry about this, where politicians have the incentive to try to solve the problem and not just pretend that if we give big livestock operations enough money that they can just keep doing business as usual. And I don't know, there is no way to define how you reach that tipping point. But I think forums like this and, continued advocacy and outreach work like Alexis and Sandy's organizations are doing, great, clear reporting about this, like you're doing, like Tom Henry, who's here, is done in the Blade. It's not gonna happen overnight. It's gonna be a long process, but I think, if you can keep pressure coming through the legal means that we have, however limited they may be at times, and the broader public advocacy, you're going to get to the point where there'll be the political will to start to deal with the problem. You cannot have business as usual with agriculture, particularly with big livestock operations and a clean Lake Erie in Ohio. You can't have both. Leadership's going to have to decide which one do they want.
Well, I want to thank Sandy and Alexis and Rob for their time and participating, for everybody tuning in. And just one last note from me, just to give everybody an idea of the extent and compass of this, what we're talking about. In Michigan alone, 4 billion gallons of liquid manure poured on the land, and 400 million tons of solid waste are poured on our land. This is according to our Department of Environmental, Great Lakes and Energy. And they don't have a clear idea of really how much more is poured on because of the manifest system. Farms can shift the control and management of it if they move this stuff off their farm. It's a big issue, and we have in our state, many harmful algal blooms. If you go to the Eagles website, they keep a monitor of it. Right now, it's about 12 in our state is happening. Up here, downstate, even Lake Superior has some of these algal blooms now showing in pretty much undeveloped shoreline. So this is a serious question. It's national, it's global. We've crossed this, toxic algal bloom challenge all over the world now. So appreciate the conversation. Thank you for tuning in. Carl?
Hey, thanks, Keith. Really appreciate it. And that's Keith Schneider, Circle of Blue's senior editor. And we've covered many of these stories around the world. And this is definitely a complicated one here, but not one without solutions, as we heard. Also, and behind the scenes, just want to say thank you to Laura Hurd and Rebecca Fedewa and Amber DeLind over at Bridge for making this possible today, and also running the tech. And we did extend invitations to members of the farm community interviewed for the series who are taking action. And unfortunately, they were unable to participate due to schedule conflicts. So to learn more about harmful algae blooms and what you can do, turn to the Great Lakes News Collaborative for full coverage. And that's online, on the radio, and on television. And I want to say special thanks too to our supporters here from Bosch and the Herb Family Foundation for supporting this series with Circle of Blue and Bridge, Michigan. And also a special thank you to the Herb Foundation as well as Joyce Foundation for supporting Circle of Blue's special coverage. and to the Mott Foundation for supporting the Great Lakes News Collaborative. Much appreciated for making this nonprofit journalism possible. And we couldn't do it without you and our donors. So this program will be posted online shortly. And so for Circle of Blue and Bridge Michigan, I'm J. Carl Ganter, and thanks so much for joining us for lunch today.